Now, our former diplomatic correspondent, Angus McDermid, presents a special birthday edition of one of our longest-running programmes.
30 years ago today, when the first edition of From Our Own Correspondent was broadcast, no one could have foreseen that it would become an institution in BBC radio journalism. It was felt that foreign correspondents deserved a more relaxed outlet for their work than the fast and factual reporting of daily programmes. Excellent material was being scrapped for lack of space, so why not assemble some of these offcuts into a new programme? Very quickly it became a programme in its own right. Correspondents, in the jargon of their trade, abbreviated its title to FOOK, and spoke of composing a fooker. One foreign editor coined the more delicate form of fooser, but the earlier catchword stuck. The programme soon developed into the shape it has kept to this day, a collection of short radio essays, more personal and opinionated than the news, and taking a penetrating look behind the headlines. Although the world has changed almost beyond recognition since those early days, some things haven't. A constant preoccupation from the very first edition has been the East-West relationship. In the tense climate of today, with its storms over the expulsion and defection of alleged spies, we sometimes forget the depths to which relations sank in the 1950s, when the Cold War and McCarthyism were at their height. From Our Own Correspondent has always focused on the human realities behind the rhetoric of East-West conflict. In 1960, another espionage crisis prevented the holding of an East-West summit conference when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was brought to trial before a Moscow court, and Ian McDougall for the BBC was among the foreign correspondents present. Here's an extract from his eyewitness report, now in the archives.
There stood this young, crew-cut, rather diffident, simple, polite man, surrounded by the entire apparatus of Soviet law, and knowing himself to be, as he said himself, the cause of a lot of trouble. There he stood looking like what in fact he was, the college boy who could earn pocket money by acting as a lifeguard on a beach, who could go into flying because he liked flying and asked no questions about what or where he was flying. An astonishingly naive person, yet a charming one, a frightened man with his back to the wall, a boy who wanted to own his own service station and instead found himself the cause of his president not being able to come to Russia.
8 years later, years during which the Berlin Wall went up, the Russians put a man into space, and Khrushchev was ousted, Soviet troops invaded Czechoslovakia. Socialism with a human face and the Prague Spring ended abruptly. The tanks rumbled through the streets of the Czechoslovak capital, and Robert Elphick was there to capture the atmosphere.
The most poignant scene in Prague these days is played out daily round the big equestrian monument of the Saint King of Bohemia, our good King Wenceslas. Since the beginning of the invasion, it's been the focus for protest, hung with black flags and the Czechoslovak national tricolour. But now it's been scrubbed clean of all the posters and slogans telling the Russians to go home, and it's become something like a national shrine. A shrine, moreover, which isn't kept up by the government, but by the efforts of the ordinary people. Fresh flowers appear daily at the foot of the statue, and the national flag and the black flag of mourning gets carried in informal relays by young people, old people, long-haired beatniks in jeans, and spruce young soldiers. They've been keeping it up for days now, sorrowing for the people who were killed in the early days of the invasion, and also for Czechoslovakia's lost independence.
12 years later, it was the turn of the Poles to rebel. In August 1980, Tim Sebastian reported from the port of Gdansk, where workers at the great Lenin shipyard had downed tools after weeks of unrest.
In the early dawn light, the Lenin shipyard looked like the scene of a minor revolution. Groups of workers stood cold and silent at the main gates. Others sat on the high walls around the yard, holding flags. Lookouts posted to watch for any signs of trouble. Inside, the ships, some finished, some still just steel shells, stood gaunt and empty in their docks. As the sun came up, a few workers emerged from huts and canteens. Some walked around in dressing gowns and pajamas. Most of them hadn't changed for 4 days. They looked pale, hungry, and determined, all the characteristics of traditional revolutionaries. These, though, are the workers that have challenged directly the authority of a Marxist state, where revolution is billed as an ongoing process. Poland's politicians often talk about the class struggle in various parts of the world. The signs are they didn't expect to see it on their own doorstep.
What he'd seen was the genesis of the Solidarity movement, which later challenged Poland's communist system. Again and again, From Our Own Correspondent has reflected the human rights situation in Eastern Europe, as well as the varying fortunes of détente. Clive Small, who's just retired after several years as our Washington correspondent, takes stock of East-West relations today.
When I joined the BBC, relations between Russia and her former allies were sliding into the Cold War. Both sides had the bomb. Robert Oppenheimer, father of nuclear weapons, described Russia and America as two scorpions in a bottle. Now, as I leave the corporation, East-West relations seem as cold as ever. The scorpions are still in the bottle. Their sting is far more deadly. They've improved the techniques for heading off war by miscalculation, but the weapons to wipe out the world have reached mind-boggling megatonnage. That deadly, edgy relationship has had its ups and downs. Soon after the death of Stalinism, we witnessed that amiable team, Bulganin and Khrushchev, travelling around dispensing goodwill and gold cigarette cases. Bulge and crush, we called them, heralds of a new relaxed atmosphere across the Iron Curtain. But then the spectacle of Khrushchev storming out of a summit with President Eisenhower, that weekend of the Cuban crisis, when the world sat on the edge of its chair and it looked as though the missiles would fly. Then détente, with Nixon and Brezhnev slapping each other on the back. Finally, Jimmy Carter and the aging Brezhnev going further and exchanging kisses over the salt in Vienna. Now, though, the world's back in a cold climate. By March 1983, Russia and America had piled up enough weapons to destroy each other and all the spectators with them. Deterrence was reaching its limit, perhaps. Was there a chance that they'd halt the build-up? Then President Reagan startled his own advisers and the rest of the world to boot. He sought an escape from the deadlock. He launched a new search for security, defense in space. His critics say Star Wars will only open yet another round in the arms contest. And on the face of it, space weapons could wreck the November summit. But all is not pessimism. The prospect of Star Wars may concentrate the minds of both Mr. Gorbachev and President Reagan. The thought of unleashing another generation of childlike scientists on new forms of ingenious destruction, the thought of the staggering and probably fruitless costs, all that may cause the superpowers to draw back, think again. The other day I was talking to Senator George Mitchell of the state of Maine. He'd just come back from seeing Mr. Gorbachev, and he'd come away with some optimism for future relations. He thought the November summit could produce an agreed framework for negotiations, and from there, reductions in the missile stockpiles. Senator Mitchell doesn't toe the White House line on all issues, but he did think President Reagan wanted some form of arms control. And the senator thought Mr. Gorbachev was dead set against diverting Soviet technology onto Star Wars because he wanted to put his effort into invigorating the dismal Soviet economy. Comparing the Russian and American economies, one Soviet official told the senator sardonically, "We don't have unemployed people outside our factories," and he went on, "Our unemployed are inside the factories." On the American side, the nation that's about to launch billions of dollars into space is now deeper in debt than Mexico, Brazil, and many another nation in the red. The children of America's present baby boom may go bust, just as today's Midwest farmers and their banks are heading for wholesale bankruptcy, just as textiles, footwear, steel, mining, and other sectors of the economy are in deep trouble. So the incentives are there for a more stable relationship. So are the dangers. The distrust remains. But if these two leaders do as they say and meet each other halfway, there is a chance of a period of cautious coexistence.
Clive Small from Washington. Another constant theme over 3 decades has been the conflict in the Middle East, where deep-seated regional hostilities have overlapped with superpower rivalry. From Our Own Correspondent carried many moving dispatches during the Arab-Israeli wars of 1967 and 1973. It was just after the second of these conflicts that Philip Short in Damascus shrewdly observed that the Syrians were among the most nationalistic of all the Arabs and would accept no lasting peace until they'd won back the Golan Heights from Israel.
While the fighting was still going on, there was what I can only describe as an attitude of heroic calm among the civilian population. Indeed, there's no doubt that if there'd been a referendum in Syria on the ceasefire resolution, it would have been rejected. And while it's very difficult to tell how much the ordinary Syrian really knew of the true position at the battlefront, I don't think his dislike of the ceasefire terms was solely due to ignorance of the military situation. At the end of the first week of the fighting, President Assad said quite explicitly that there'd been reverses as well as advances, and that in the sort of tactical war the Syrian army was fighting, this kind of thing was bound to continue. And even when official Syrian communiques said little about the position at the front, news filtered back through relatives in the army remarkably quickly. At the bank where I changed my money, for example, I found that the cashier knew more accurately than either the Israelis or the Syrians had publicly stated just where the Israelis had reached in their attempt to advance on Damascus. My own view is that if the Syrians wanted to continue fighting, it was because they'd geared themselves to the prospect of a long war.
Since then, Syria has taken over the role once played by Nasser's Egypt as the regional centre of Arab nationalism, as Gerald Butt now explains.
One day in the early 1960s, I was being driven around one of the cities in the Gulf states by a British diplomat. As we drove through a poor area of the city, we were given what were unmistakably hostile looks. "Oh, they're basically friendly," the diplomat said. "It's just that they listen to too much Cairo radio." Looking back, that statement spoke volumes about the particular era, the wide, almost romantic appeal of Cairo radio, and the concern felt in the West about its power. For this was the era that fed on the rhetoric of secular pan-Arab unity that was intended to replace Western domination and to take on Israel, a dream fostered by that giant of a country, Egypt, and that giant of a leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. This era, though, came to a spectacular close in June 1967, when the Six-Day War with Israel began. The humiliating defeat was a catastrophe for President Nasser, for Egypt, for the whole of the Arab world, and for the hopes of pan-Arab unity. Nasser never really recovered. Pride was restored to a large extent by the next Arab-Israeli war in October 1973. President Sadat had taken over from President Nasser, and Egypt had become a very different place, looking to the west rather than to the socialist bloc, later, of course, to find itself out in the cold after the signing of the Camp David agreements with Israel. The aftermath of the October War brought euphoria to the Arab world, with the oil-producing states realizing, and for a time using to their advantage, the hold they had over an oil-hungry West. But the Arab world lacked a leader, although it did not lack contenders for that role. Iraq, for example, tried to maneuver itself into the position, only to ruin its chances by getting bogged down in a long and costly war with Iran. If any one country emerged as the prominent force in the region, it was Syria. President Hafez al-Assad lacks the charisma of President Nasser. Syria, as a country, Moscow's main ally in the region, does not have the stature or the appeal of Egypt. Nevertheless, Syria became, and is today, a country whose influence is felt in every major issue in the region. Syria boasts that it's the one and only confrontation state, the only Arab country prepared to do battle with Israel to try to recover occupied lands, as it did, unsuccessfully, in 1967 and 73, and again, albeit briefly and reluctantly, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. The day that Syria and Israel agreed to a ceasefire in Lebanon, I watched a captured Israeli tank being driven through Damascus, bedecked with jubilant Syrian troops. It was one of the few spoils of war that Syria could boast. In general, it had suffered huge losses, being badly outgunned by Israel. The view in Damascus is that there should be no new war with Israel until such time as Syria and other Arab countries can match Israeli firepower, and no negotiated peace bargained from a position of weakness. Damascus believes this is exactly what King Hussein of Jordan and the PLO chairman Mr. Yasser Arafat are pursuing. While Syria waits for this balance of power to be achieved, it has plenty to concern itself with, most notably Lebanon, that once beautiful, once enticing country that for the past 10 years has been in the throes of slow, painful self-destruction, helped by outside powers regional and international. It's now fallen to Syria to try to put together what's left of this politically and religiously fractured nation. Both Israel and the United States tried to fashion Lebanon to suit their own purposes, but found themselves, like many before them, sinking into the Lebanese quagmire. America persuaded Lebanon to sign what amounted to a friendship agreement with Israel against Syria's wishes. A year later, that agreement was scrapped, and the Americans had pulled out ignominiously from Beirut. Washington had been slow in learning one of the lessons of the mid-1980s. Whatever your feelings, one way or the other, ignore Syria at your peril.
Our Middle East correspondent, Gerald Butt. When From Our Own Correspondent began, Africa's wind of change was barely perceptible, but within a few years African decolonization had become a major topic, and in a period of almost breathless change, I was the correspondent covering a large area of the continent. There were the long years of instability in the former Belgian Congo, now Zaire. I saw leaders like Ghana's Nkrumah tumble dramatically and military governments rise and fall with depressing frequency. It required an almost clairvoyant instinct to foresee where trouble would next arise. I remember calling unexpectedly on the cabinet secretary in one Central African country. He looked up from his files, clearly startled, and asked, "What's the BBC doing here? Is there something going on I should know about?" When Nigeria, the giant of black Africa, became independent in 1960, it was expected to become a model of stable government. But within a few years it too had sunk into tumult, with the attempted secession of its eastern region, calling itself Biafra. Martin Bell, who covered that long and bitter civil war with me, followed the federal Nigerian troops into the Biafran capital, Enugu, when they reoccupied it.
Enugu today is a dead city. Services have been cut off and not resumed. Nothing moves in the streets except for vultures, stray dogs, and patrols of the Federal Army. Shops and houses have been broken into, and their contents strewn about. Some of the buildings have suffered badly from shell damage, though the devastation is not so total in Enugu itself as in the villages to the north of it. These are now, by any standards, quite uninhabitable, and they present the federal government with the first and most urgent of its post-war problems. This is the question not just of housing and feeding the dispossessed Igbos whose homes lay in the path of battle, but first of all of finding them. They had, in many cases, been the victims of false Biafran assurances that their side was winning the war. They had no inkling of what was really happening until federal troops entered their villages. Then they just took to the bush.
Although independent Africa's battles focus on internal enmities, the colonial legacy lingers on in artificial boundaries and in South Africa's apartheid system. But the immediate dangers facing many African territories today are drought and starvation, as Mike Wooldridge reports.
At about 4 o'clock one Friday afternoon last October, a man was taking his last gasping and painful breaths on the floor of a corrugated iron famine relief shelter at Mekelle in northern Ethiopia. When he fell silent, his wife looked up with an expression that asked one question: why had her husband quite literally starved to death before her eyes? Daybreak 2 days later at Coram brought another scene I shall never forget. The dead were being brought in from all corners of a huge field where several thousand famine victims were living out in the open in ragged and flimsy clothing in a temperature only a little above freezing. The bodies were wrapped in any cloth or sacking that was available and laid out on makeshift stretchers for the relatives to take them away for burial. Soon nearly 40 stretchers were lined up side by side on the parched soil that had yielded no crop for 3 seasons. The bodies of a small child and its mother lay together on one stretcher. If that were one of my own children, I kept thinking. A relief worker at Mekelle spoke of the heartbreaking decision she faced each morning because there was enough food for only a fraction of the emaciated people clawing at the gate, and she knew those she turned away could well die. The full horror of the Ethiopian famine hit the world, to be followed later by a tragedy of similar proportions in Sudan, and in a swathe of other countries across Africa there were also mass migrations in search of inadequate supplies of food. The crisis has focused attention on black Africa to an extent that has not happened since the era of decolonization. the half-truths about Africa have resurfaced, that many African governments don't care what happens to their own people, particularly the voiceless rural poor, that Africans have themselves to blame for their plight because they have too many children, that where the West exploited Africa in the past through colonialism, it now does so under the guise of aid that is of more benefit to the donor and the urban elite in the receiving country than to those who need it most. But for each factory, tractor, or piece of sophisticated hospital equipment that now stands idle in Africa because it's too expensive to operate or because no one can maintain it, there's a clinic somewhere that has succeeded in reducing the number of avoidable child deaths, or a water supply has been installed that means that the women of a village no longer have to trudge several miles each day to fetch water. The most disturbing statistic emerging from Africa is that the amount of food produced per person is declining across much of the continent. Many independent governments have neglected the peasant farmer to their cost, failing to pay him a proper price for his crops and failing to help him adopt more modern farming techniques. This is now being increasingly recognized within the continent as well as outside. But harder to reverse is the effect of years of overcultivation, overgrazing, and destruction of forests for fuel wood, which has turned once productive land to dust in many areas. Armed conflicts in half a dozen countries have further hampered development, worsened the food shortages, and helped to create 3 million refugees. My first assignment as East Africa correspondent took me to a village on the Somali side of the Ethiopian border, a classic example of a straight line drawn on a map that divided people of the same culture, language, and religion. The villagers, guarded against Ethiopian air attack by a single and ancient anti-aircraft gun, regaled me with allegations of atrocities by Ethiopian troops, matched by similar claims about the activities of Somali troops when I later visited the other side of the border. Who knows whether the Organization of African Unity was right when it decided that to allow the colonial boundaries of Africa to be changed would cause more trouble than to keep them as they were. Perhaps the only issue that has justified the unity in the OAU's title is its opposition to apartheid, despite the fact that a number of its members have always been compromised by having to trade with and through South Africa. There can be little doubt that the replacement of apartheid by a system of government that allowed the whole of sub-Saharan Africa to benefit openly and fully from the strength of South Africa's industrial base could be part of the salvation of Africa.
Our East Africa correspondent, Mike Wooldridge. If Africa's decolonisation brought turmoil and confusion, the former French colonies of Indochina fared worse. After long years of Japanese oppression, the soft underbelly of Asia was torn apart by rival ideologies, big power politics, and a quarter-century of war in Vietnam. In 1970, 15 years after American advisors first landed in South Vietnam, Anthony Lawrence captured the grinding soullessness of life in the jungle for American troops.
In this infantryman's life, the great thing is to come safe home, to keep your ass covered, as the soldiers call it. There's a vast gap between, on the one side, the junior officers, NCOs and men, and on the other, the higher ranks, the career officers, the so-called lifers. It's the lifers who believe in conventional discipline. But the men who stay out in the forests, beating the bush as they call it, they're all, including lieutenants, on Christian name terms and no formality, except that everyone does what he has to do. I never thought about morale, said one young lieutenant. The life certainly changes you a lot. Luxury to me is staying in a forest clearing for one whole afternoon without having to move on. A drink from a cold stream's a gift from heaven. A bed to sleep on, unimaginable.
During the long years of the Vietnam War, the West regarded the spread of Chinese communism as the primary threat in the Far East. Nowadays the picture is entirely different. Though still at odds with the Soviet Union, China has opened its doors to the West. The turning point came with the fall of the Gang of Four, as Chairman Mao's widow and her colleagues were known. The BBC's first correspondent in Peking, Philip Short, was at their trial.
Certainly all the panoply of justice is there. The sleek, round-faced judges dressed in black, the procurators in grey, 35 of them altogether, sitting in serried ranks on their crimson upholstered benches, and the accused in the dock, escorted by blue-garbed police bailiffs. But the substance of the law is absent. It's a grotesque, sad parody of a trial that's unfolding in Peking, and it belongs not in the courtroom, but on the political stage. The accused are not given an opportunity to state their innocence or guilt until after the evidence has been completed, and only then are they told what articles of the law they're charged under.
The trial may not have been more than a judicial farce, but it symbolized a watershed in China's development, as Mark Brain now explains.
In 1980, as Philip Short reported, it may have been the Gang of Four and their associates who were in court. But the case was much more. It was a symbolic reckoning with the entire politics of extreme leftism that in Mao Zedong's later years had held China in such savage grip. Those years were hell for many Chinese. They were not easy either for the few Western journalists able to report then from Peking. At its worst, the xenophobia of the Cultural Revolution saw the Reuters correspondent, Anthony Gray, incarcerated in his own home for the best part of 2 years. For ordinary Chinese, contact with a foreigner could mean imprisonment for spying, even death. Travel for journalists was virtually impossible. It was less from Peking that news about China could be gleaned than in Hong Kong, reading from afar the tea leaves of the mainland Chinese press, talking to refugees, following the local pro-Peking newspapers. Since the late 1970s, and particularly in the last couple of years or so, that grim picture has changed out of all recognition. Philip Short was one of the first of what soon became a flood of Western and Japanese correspondents setting up office in Peking. Altogether, we now number over 100, and many more are constantly passing through, including the other day the BBC's former chief tea leaf reader in Hong Kong, Anthony Lawrence. He's now writing a book about Mao Zedong's Long March, and in one of Peking's swish new Western-managed hotels, he spoke of his amazement at how much more civilized life here has become. It is, for example, incomparably easier to make contact with Chinese. In the short time I've been here, less than a year, new rules have allowed us journalists to set up our own interviews and file our own queries directly with Chinese organizations and enterprises. Not that we always get either a full or an accurate answer, but at least the mechanisms of access are being established in what remains a very closed society. The BBC in particular is no longer a tool of imperialist propaganda, but I'm repeatedly assured by Chinese I meet, a respected source of news, and especially of sound English language instruction. Restrictions on travel have eased beyond all recognition. It's difficult to conceive now that 10 years ago even Shanghai was out of bounds. Today, in ever-increasing contrast to the difficulties of travel in the Soviet Union, foreigners in China can visit more than 100 destinations without any special permission at all, and 200 more with. The number of open areas is growing all the time, where you can just get on a plane or train and go, if, that is, you can get a ticket in the crush of fellow would-be travelers. There's much that's still changing only slowly in China. Social attitudes, the power of personal connections, the distrust of individualism. But China's perceptions of itself and the outside world have, nevertheless, shifted fundamentally. Yesterday's paper tigers of imperialism are today's partners in trade and valued political friends. Yesterday's austerity and Maoist egalitarianism have given way to a honeymoon with consumerism, fashion, music, and travel. Private initiative is no longer a capitalist tail that must be severed, but the backbone of a new prosperity in a countryside rid of Mao's communes. To the outside world, the Chinese no longer appear an amorphous, mysterious, and threatening army of identical blue ants, waving identical red books and shouting identical hysterical slogans. They've become ordinary people, ready to admit to their ordinary cares, joys, and problems. When Mao died in 1976, there can have been few who would have believed that such change could come in so short a time.
Our Peking correspondent, Mark Brain. While our correspondents have reported from the most remote corners of the globe, they have not neglected our continental neighbours nearer home. From Our Own Correspondent was 17 years old when Britain joined the European Economic Community after years of hard negotiation. In 1969, when France's President de Gaulle resigned, a major obstacle to Britain's entry was removed, as our correspondent in Brussels, Christopher Serpell, was quick to point out.
The climate has changed, said one of those who attended this, the first meeting of the Common Market Foreign Ministers in Brussels since the new French government was installed. Now it's a discussion between equals, and no longer an audience granted to 5 foreign ministers by the General's vicar here on earth. And even the outside observer waiting in the squalid and airless antechambers of the Palais des Congrès could sense the alteration. The new French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Schuman, introduced himself with a speech that was disarming, almost placatory in tone. Behind those resounding Gallic abstractions, one could sense an appeal that France should be allowed to change direction with the dignity and deliberation due to a great nation.
Despite the better prospects for British entry to the European community, Christopher Serpell warned that we would have to step prudently. Otherwise, as he put it, the gate might be slammed. Our present Brussels correspondent, Stephen Jessel, reflects on how the community has developed since then.
The gate was not, after all, slammed, though in the years to come perhaps some of the original 6 were to regret that it hadn't been. Whether it would have been in the interests both of Britain and of the founders of the original community that Britain stayed out is a question for another programme in another decade, even another century. So far, clearly, neither the brightest hopes of the pro-marketeers nor the deepest fears of the antis have been realised. Europe is not an economic unity, let alone a political one. The Federalists have made little progress. On the other hand, neither Mrs. Thatcher's Britain nor President Mitterrand's France show many signs of having surrendered their sovereignty to the grey men of Brussels and Strasbourg. It's tempting and very easy to mock the slow pace of the development of the community. It's recently been announced, for example, that in the case of car crashes in Luxembourg, insurance assessors from other member states will be allowed to examine the damage. As the French showed earlier this year over South Africa, the temptation for members to go their own way is sometimes irresistible. Out of the headquarters printing presses comes a polyglot paper mountain, much of it trivial. But journeys are made up of individual steps, and there are achievements to show. However wrong-headed the common agricultural policy may be, it does exist. And if one goes back to the time of Christopher Serpell's report 16 years ago, would it have been realistic then to think of the 10 members of the present community negotiating as a single entity with Japan and the United States, or coordinating their foreign policies, with odd lapses, it's true, as closely as now they do? Against which have to be set such divisive issues as budget contributions and reform of the common agricultural policy, a particularly formidable task when it's remembered that for some states, keeping people at work and on the land is as important as creating a leaner, more efficient agricultural sector. But perhaps the central reality, recognised fairly widely now, is that whatever direction Europe is to take, the time is not unlimited. No individual state in Europe can compete with the economic superpowers. But next January, Spain and Portugal will join the community, and the population of the 12 will then be 320 million, just about the combined totals of the United States and Japan. If there really were a single European market for goods and services, from Jutland to Gibraltar, from Galway to Crete, and if industrial attitudes could be changed, Europe might be well placed to compete on the basis of its vast home market with the giants. Assuming that to be desirable, which many on the political left might not, how do you get there? Even here there's some agreement that you cannot afford to sail at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy, that you have to be able to reach decisions more swiftly and execute them more purposefully. And at the back of that issue is a question that goes back to the 1960s. Can you allow individual states a veto if they feel that what is being planned is a threat to their own national interests? Clearly, everyone wants more things decided by majority voting, but is it possible or prudent actually to start altering the Treaty of Rome? And then again, what exactly is this European Union about which so much is said? I don't think that it's caricaturing the British position to say that Britain is deeply interested in European economic union, for the simple reason that Britain could expect to do quite well out of it, while being equally unenthusiastic about political union. Other members place more emphasis on political union, arguing in some cases that the road to economic union lies through political union. In 1969, Christopher Serpell predicted that before being admitted to the EEC, we should be asked what our political motive was. Good question then, good question now.
Stephen Jessel from Brussels. Until comparatively recently, Latin America was not a major news area, while the republics of Central America might not have existed for all that one heard about them. That was before the importation of the Cold War into the civil wars of Central America brought the region into the headlines. In 1981, when Martin Bell contemplated the scene in El Salvador, it reminded him irresistibly of a film location for a Hollywood Western.
In any northern town, the scene is much the same. The church square, dusty and hot, a parking lot for army trucks. Soldiers back from patrol camped out on verandas, the few remaining civilians retrieving possessions, the football pitch turned into a helicopter pad, a sentry standing guard beside the church bells in the tower. Here a movie maker could attempt an update of the Return of the Magnificent Seven without having to import a single prop or extra. But the only theatre this is a theatre of war. It's a war where the odds should be with the government, but yet don't seem to be. Huge areas of the northern provinces, Chalatenango, Cabañas and Morazan, are either still under rebel control or so hotly contested that the people have fled long since. It is a beautiful landscape of spectacular hill country in which, however, nothing moves but the dogs, the birds, the smoke from an occasional mortar shell, and the patrols of either side. Even those are not so frequent.
As El Salvador's civil war continues unabated, one of the big questions of the 1980s remains the future of Central America, seen by the United States as its backyard, from which communism must be excluded. But according to Robert Tyra in Rio de Janeiro, the more important story in the years to come will be about Latin America's economic crisis.
There was a time, well within the lifetime of this program, when Latin America usually found itself in the news only for the most disturbing of reasons: political upheaval or natural disaster. Events in Cuba and Chile added a moral dimension to our views of the region, arguing whether or not it was right for the United States to try to topple left-wing governments in its hemisphere. The violence in Central America and President Reagan's reaction to it has sharpened this moral debate. But since August 1982, when Mexico suddenly announced that it could not pay its debts, Latin America has mattered for something that's generally taken a great deal more seriously than morality, and that's money. A country like Brazil, which has surpassed Mexico and now owes more than $100,000 million that it looks increasingly unwilling to pay, sends shivers through important places around the world that are quite unconcerned by the toils of El Salvador. The small core of foreign correspondents who roam the airways of Latin America is still racked by anxiety about which is the better story. It's more satisfying to be on the front page or high in the news bulletin recalling an incident of inhumanity from El Salvador than it is to try to fan the flames of interest in the Brazilian internal deficit. But our actions indicate where the bigger story lies. We've swapped our t-shirts and jeans for suits and ties. Reporters I used to bump into in the cluttered parlours of shrewd Central American priests seeking assistance in unravelling the roots of repression now turn up in the suffocating traffic jams of Buenos Aires, crawling from economist to statistician in search of insight on the Argentine debt. There was a time when a correspondent in Latin America could go far with a few scraps of knowledge. The ability to tell incoming gunfire from outgoing, a few dirty jokes in Spanish, and a pocketful of salt to staunch the effects of tear gas. Now there are new necessities: a sharp understanding of the vocabulary of economics in Portuguese, a keen way with numbers, and a strong nose for financial jiggery-pokery. The way of life has changed. Instead of planning to rise at dawn to look for action in the Salvadoran countryside, I expect to go to bed with the sunrise, desperately trying to keep my memory's grip on some miraculous and masterfully simple economic analysis, sketched out among the late-night wine glasses by an emotional technocrat from the central bank. When I go travelling around the enormous Latin American beat, my briefcase bulges with economic dictionaries and balance sheets, and with cuttings from the financial press. Things may change. President Reagan may overcome congressional resistance and be able to stoke the fires he's trying to burn under the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Failure may overtake the slowly spreading awareness of Salvadorans that politics can be conducted by other means than murder. Elections this year in Guatemala and Honduras may be farcical. And on the broader picture, the debts of Brazil and the other Latin American giants may upset their present tendency to profess and practice democracy. The wheel of political freedom and repression has turned relentlessly throughout the lifetime of this program, and perhaps it will go on doing so. Certainly there'll be more political violence and natural disasters to grab the headlines. But it's my personal view that Latin America won't revert to its old stereotypes. To be a debtor is altogether more respectable than to be a street fighter. And in this jump onto the financial pages, the Latin Americans have told the world they must be taken seriously in future.
Our Latin America correspondent, Robert Tyrer. One of the great advantages of reporting for From Our Own Correspondent has been the opportunity to get away from the treadmill of politics. I once wrote a lyrical dispatch not on the difficulties of covering a revolution, but of getting to it. And some of the program's most telling stories have been about people and the way they live. David Willey, for instance, gave an emphatic thumbs down to Italian sanitation when he described a cholera epidemic in Naples, one of Europe's smelliest cities, he said.
A scapegoat was found for the cholera outbreak, the humble mussel, a shellfish much appreciated by the local population and cultivated in large quantities in what used to be the limpid blue waters of the Bay of Naples. Unfortunately, the lack of modern sewage disposal methods, the sewers of Naples are over 100 years old, means that the picture postcard bay is now heavily polluted by the 3 million inhabitants clustered along the coast, and cases of shellfish poisoning are commonplace. The counterattack on the mollusk population was swift and deadly. In a combined land, sea and air operation, police frogmen amputated millions of innocent mussels from their floating beds, while helicopters hovered overhead and strong forces of police stood by on the shore, bristling with weapons, to prevent riots among the indignant Neapolitan mussel fishermen and traders who've been optimistically promised compensation for their lost livelihood.
Ian Mitchell in Bonn used some bizarre courtroom exchanges in a German terrorist trial in 1976 to express the total communication gap between the West German authorities and urban guerrillas of the Baader-Meinhof group.
The witness goes into the political reasons for wanting violent revolution, to strike a blow against U.S. imperialism and West Germany as its European center. The judge asks the prosecution if it has any questions. The questions posed. "Who's that talking?" asks the witness, and turns in his swivel chair to look at the prosecution. "Oh, one of them. I don't want to talk to them. Forget it." The judge suggests that the witness must reply. "Old pig," is the retort. "You called me an old pig?" "You are. I therefore impose on you 1 further week in prison. You called me an old pig." The formality of the proceedings is preserved as the judge cuts out the witness's microphone.
And finally, one of From Our Own Correspondent's best-known voices, Michael Elkins in Jerusalem, on the impossibility of getting efficient and friendly service in Israeli restaurants.
The thing you need most when going into one of the swankier Israeli restaurants, apart from a barrel of Spondylix, of course, or a credit card of pure gold, is a voice like a seagull discovering floating orange peel and the willingness to use it to attract the attention of waiters whose essential gift for their profession is the fact that they were born blind and deaf and hard-hearted to boot. Otherwise you will starve or perish of thirst. With some sterling exceptions, of course, the Israeli waiter is a living, alas, living testimonial to the inapplicability of Milton's line that they also serve who only stand and wait. The Israeli waiter stands and waits, presumably for the end of the working day. He doesn't serve, or at least he tries to avoid it.
That was 7 years ago. Since then, Israel's runaway inflation has no doubt made those who wait even more reluctant to serve. But I hope you've heard enough to convince you that Milton's dictum does not apply to our own correspondents. In their job, they can rarely afford to stand and wait, yet they've never failed to serve From Our Own Correspondent with a smile, and its 30 years are a testimonial to that.
Angus McDermid presented From Our Own Correspondent, The World 30 Years On. The producer was Zaria Masani, and Angus McDermid celebrates the history of From Our Own Correspondent in the latest edition of The Listener.